The wind howled against the rocky slopes of the mountain, carrying dust and whispers of a forgotten past. David Carter adjusted the strap of his backpack, squinting at the enormous stone structure ahead. The locals on this strange planet had warned him. No one climbed the cursed mountain and returned. They spoke of an ancient being trapped at the peak, a force too dangerous to be freed. But David was not one to believe in myths. He was an explorer, a scientist, and a man who had spent years traveling across distant planets, seeking knowledge. His ship had landed in this remote region just 2 days ago, and now, standing before the towering cliffs, he felt something he couldn't explain, a strange pull, as if something was waiting for him at the top. His boots crunched against the brittle rocks as he began his ascent. The climb was treacherous, with loose stones shifting underfoot and sharp gusts threatening to knock him off balance. The air grew thinner as he climbed higher, and an unnatural silence settled around him. Hours passed before he finally reached a flat, open plateau near the summit. He wiped sweat from his forehead and took a deep breath. But then, he saw her. At the center of the plateau stood a tall stone pillar, its surface covered in glowing alien symbols. Chained to it was a woman, but not just any woman. She was unlike any being he had ever seen. Her skin shimmered like silver under the pale light, and her long flowing hair, white as snow, danced in the wind. Her eyes were closed, her face serene, but her body was bound by glowing chains of pure energy, wrapped tightly around her wrists, ankles, and waist. For a long moment, David just stared. Who was she? How long had she been here? The chains pulsed faintly, humming with an unknown power. He stepped closer, feeling a strange warmth in the air. Then her eyes snapped open. David stumbled back, his heart racing. Her eyes were a brilliant shade of violet, filled with something between surprise and suspicion. You? Her voice was soft, hoarse, as if she had not spoken in a long time. You are not one of them. David hesitated, his mind racing. One of who? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she studied him carefully, as if trying to understand what he was. You are human, she finally said, a strange expression crossing her face. How? David frowned. How do you know about humans? Again, she didn't answer. Instead, she lowered her gaze to the chains wrapped around her body. The energy pulsed softly, like a heartbeat. You should not be here, she warned. Leave. Now. David looked at the chains, then back at her. Who did this to you? He asked, stepping closer. She exhaled slowly. A race long forgotten. They feared me. So they sealed me here. David's curiosity grew stronger. He wasn't afraid. If anything, he was fascinated. Feared you. Why? Her violet eyes locked onto his. Because I did not obey. A chill ran down his spine. This wasn't just a prisoner. This was someone who had defied an empire. David's fingers hovered near the chains. They pulsed again, reacting to his presence. Something in him whispered that he shouldn't touch them. But another part, the part that had led him on countless adventures, urged him forward. He reached out. The moment his fingertips brushed against the glowing chains, a shockwave burst through the air. The sky above rumbled, the symbols on the stone pillar flashing brightly. The chains cracked, flickering like dying embers. David staggered back as the mountain itself seemed to tremble. The woman gasped, her eyes widening. She looked at him, her expression one of pure disbelief. What have you done? The chains began breaking apart, their energy dissolving into the wind. And for the first time in centuries, Lyra was no longer bound. The moment the last chain shattered, the air around them grew heavy with an unseen force. David stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. The glowing symbols on the ancient stone dimmed, their power fading as if their purpose had been fulfilled. The woman, Lyra, as he would soon learn, took her first step forward in centuries. Her silver skin shimmered under the pale light, her long white hair flowing like liquid silk. She raised her arms slowly, staring at her wrists where the chains had once bound her. Then she turned her glowing violet eyes to David. "You broke the seal," she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. David swallowed hard. He had felt something the moment he touched the chains, a deep, ancient energy responding to him, recognizing something within him. But he didn't understand how. He hesitated, glancing at the shattered remains of the glowing chains. "I just touched them. I didn't think." A deep rumbling shook the ground beneath them. David's instincts screamed at him to move. The very air around them crackled with energy, and a low mechanical voice echoed from the stone pillar. "Seal broken. Unauthorized. Release DETCTED." David's eyes widened. "That doesn't sound good." Lyara's expression darkened. She clenched her fists, her gaze fixed on the crumbling stone. "The Guardians will awaken," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "We must leave. Now." David didn't need to be told twice. He turned, ready to run down the mountain. But before he could take a step, a massive stone structure shifted. A hulking, ancient figure emerged from the ground. A mechanical sentinel, its form covered in the same glowing symbols as the pillar. Its 3 glowing red eyes locked onto them. "INTRUDER, IDENTIFIED. Prisoner must not be freed." David took a step back. "I don't suppose we can talk this out." The sentinel raised its massive arm, a glowing weapon forming at the end of its hand. Lyara's eyes flashed with fury. She lifted her hand, and for the first time since she had been freed, her power sparked to life. A pulse of silver energy burst from her fingertips, colliding with the sentinel's chest. The impact sent a shockwave rippling across the plateau, knocking David off his feet. The sentinel staggered but did not fall. "Forbidden power DTHCTD. Termination INITY. HET." David pushed himself up, his mind racing. The thing was ancient, but it was still powerful. "Can you stop it?" he asked, watching Lyra's energy crackle around her hands. "I have been chained for too long," she admitted. "My power is weak." That wasn't good. David glanced around, searching for a way out. They were on the summit of a mountain, with nowhere to hide. If they didn't act fast, they were done for. The sentinel charged forward, its massive form shaking the ground with every step. David's survival instincts kicked in. If he couldn't fight, he had to think. His eyes darted to the edge of the plateau, where a cluster of large boulders rested. An idea formed in his mind. "Can you hit it again?" he asked Lyra. She nodded, lifting her hands. Another burst of silver energy struck the sentinel, making it stumble. That was all David needed. He ran toward the boulders, ignoring the danger. He placed his hands on the largest rock and pushed with everything he had. The boulder shifted, rolling toward the edge, toward the sentinel's unbalanced form. Crack! The rock collided with the mechanical guardian, sending it teetering over the edge. For a moment, the sentinel's red eyes flickered, as if it recognized what was happening. Then, with a deafening roar of metal, it tumbled down the mountainside, vanishing into the abyss below. Silence followed. David exhaled a shaky breath, his arms burning from the effort. He had done it. Lyra stared at him, something unreadable in her expression. "You fight with your mind, not just strength," she said, stepping closer. "Humans are different." David gave a weak chuckle. "Yeah, we tend to be stubborn like that." For a moment, they just stood there, catching their breath. Then, Lyra's expression grew serious. "More will come. The seal is broken. I am free. But I am also hunted." David frowned. "Who's hunting you?" She hesitated. Then she whispered, "The ones who made the chains." A cold shiver ran down David's spine. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The air on the mountain was still heavy with the lingering energy from the shattered chains. The mechanical sentinel had fallen, its glowing red eyes disappearing into the abyss below. But David knew better than to celebrate too soon. He turned to Lyra, who stood tall despite her weakened state. Her violet eyes flickered with an emotion he couldn't quite place: relief, gratitude, and something deeper. "You said someone is hunting you," David said, brushing dust off his jacket. "Who are they?" Liara looked toward the darkening sky, as if expecting something, or someone, to arrive. "They were once rulers of many worlds," she said, her voice steady but laced with old pain. "They called themselves the Vexari Dominion. When I refused to obey their rule, they feared what I could become. So, they imprisoned me." David frowned. "Imprisoned? Not killed." Liara nodded. "They could not destroy me completely, so they sealed me here, binding my power." She looked at him, her gaze sharp. "Until you came." David scratched the back of his neck. "Yeah, I'm still not sure why touching those chains did anything." Liara studied him for a moment, then said, "Because you are human." Before David could ask what that meant, a distant humming sound filled the air. He and Liara both turned their heads toward the sky. A faint blue light flickered beyond the clouds, growing brighter by the second. Liara's expression darkened. "They're here." David's instincts screamed at him to move. "We need to get off this mountain. Now." Liara took a deep breath, her energy still weak from centuries of captivity. "There is an old passage," she said, pointing toward the far side of the plateau. "A hidden path down the cliffs. We must hurry." David didn't argue. He followed her as she moved swiftly, her steps light despite her weakened state. As they reached the edge of the summit, the humming grew louder, like the sound of a massive engine cutting through the air. David glanced back, and his stomach dropped. A sleek, black Vexari dropship emerged from the clouds, its sharp, metallic wings gleaming under the fading sunlight. The ship's underside opened, revealing mechanical soldiers, tall, humanoid machines with glowing blue visors, preparing to drop onto the plateau. "Go," Liara urged. David didn't need to be told twice. He followed her down a narrow, winding stone path, each step feeling like a life-or-death moment. The path was barely wide enough for one person at a time, and one wrong step could send them plummeting down the steep cliffs. Above them, the Vexari machines landed on the plateau, scanning the area. Their voices were cold, metallic. "Prisoner detected. Pursuit engaged." David gritted his teeth. "They're coming." Liara nodded. "Then we must move faster." Suddenly, a loud explosion echoed above. A powerful energy blast struck the cliffs, causing part of the path to collapse just ahead of them. David skidded to a halt, his heart pounding. "That's bad." Liara's eyes glowed faintly as she raised her hand. Silver energy rippled from her fingertips, forming a temporary bridge of light over the broken section. "Move," she commanded. David took a deep breath and rushed across the glowing bridge, his boots barely making a sound on the unstable energy. As soon as he reached the other side, Liara followed, and the bridge vanished behind her. But the Vexari soldiers were fast. David risked a glance upward and saw one of the machines leap down the cliffs, landing just behind them. The machine raised an arm, a bright energy blade igniting from its wrist. David reacted on pure instinct. He grabbed a loose rock from the path and hurled it at the machine's head. It wasn't much, but it distracted the soldier for a split second, just enough for Liara to raise her hand and unleash a small burst of energy straight into its chest. The machine jerked, its systems overloaded, and it fell backward off the edge, disappearing into the fog below. David let out a breath. That was too close. Liara looked at him, a faint smile touching her lips. "You fight with what you have. That is admirable." Before David could reply, another explosion rocked the mountain. The Vexari ship was firing at them, trying to cut off their escape route. David grabbed Liara's arm. "Come on, we're almost there." Just ahead, the path led into a dark cavern, hidden beneath the mountain's cliffs. Liara's eyes brightened with recognition. The old tunnels. They won't follow us there. David didn't question it. They rushed inside, the cave swallowing them in darkness just as another blast shook the mountainside. Inside, the air was damp, and the only sound was their breathing and the distant echoes of falling rock. For a moment, David just stood there, catching his breath. Then he turned to Lara. "What now?" She met his gaze, her violet eyes burning with determination. "Now," she said, "we find a way to fight back." The cave was silent and dark, the only sound being David and Lyra's breathing. The air was cool and damp, a sharp contrast to the harsh, rocky mountain outside. The entrance behind them was blocked with dust and debris from the last explosion. David leaned against the wall, catching his breath. "I hope they don't have another way in." Lyra, standing beside him, closed her eyes for a brief moment. A faint silver glow pulsed around her fingertips, as if she were sensing something unseen. "They won't come here," she said softly. "They fear these tunnels." David raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Lyra opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "Because this place is older than even the Vexari Dominion. It belonged to the ones who came before." David frowned, looking around. His flashlight flickered to life, casting long shadows on the cavern walls. Strange symbols were carved into the stone, similar to the ones he had seen on the chains that once bound Lyra. He ran his fingers over them. "These markings, do they mean anything to you?" Lyra hesitated. Then she stepped closer, brushing her hand over the ancient carvings. Her violet eyes glowed faintly, and a sudden hum filled the cave. The markings began to shimmer, responding to her touch. David stepped back. "Okay, that's new." Lyra looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I remember now." David crossed his arms. "Remember what?" She turned back to the symbols, tracing them with her fingertips. "These tunnels were once a sanctuary," she said. "Long before I was imprisoned, before the Vexari ruled, my people hid here from them." David's curiosity grew. "Your people? What happened to them?" Lyra's eyes darkened. "The Vexari happened." David clenched his fists. He didn't need more details to understand the pain behind her words. He had seen enough in his travels to know that empires like the Vexari always feared what they could not control. "So, this place," he said, glancing at the glowing symbols, "is it safe?" Lyra nodded. "For now." She stepped forward, leading him deeper into the tunnels. The further they went, the brighter the markings glowed. The walls were no longer rough stone, but smooth and metallic, as if they had entered an ancient structure buried beneath the mountain. Then the tunnel opened into a massive underground chamber. David's jaw dropped. Before them stood a vast circular room, filled with floating crystals that pulsed with a soft blue light. The floor was made of a strange, smooth material, reflecting the glow like a mirror. At the center of the room stood a large metallic pillar, humming with energy. Lyra stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "The heart of the ancients." David followed, scanning the room. "What is it?" She placed her palm against the pillar. The moment she did, the entire chamber came to life. The floating crystals shifted, casting moving patterns of light across the walls. The air hummed with energy, and David felt the hairs on his arms stand up. Then, a deep voice echoed through the chamber. "Designation, Lyra. Identity confirmed." David's eyes widened. Did that thing just? Accessing memory core. Suddenly, a holographic display appeared above the pillar, filled with glowing symbols and diagrams. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. "It still works." David stared at the floating symbols. "What exactly are we looking at?" Lyra turned to him, her expression more determined than ever. "This is what the Vexari feared," she said. "This is the last weapon of my people." David's eyes widened. "A weapon?" Lyra nodded. "Not just any weapon. The only thing that can destroy the Vexari Dominion." David exhaled slowly. Now he understood why the Vexari had chained her instead of killing her. They didn't want you to find this, he muttered. Liara met his gaze. But now, it is ours. Before David could respond, a loud mechanical noise echoed from the entrance of the chamber. His stomach twisted. They weren't alone. The Vexeri had found them. The hum of the ancient chamber grew louder, its energy pulsing in waves. David and Liara stood frozen, their eyes locked on the entrance. Then the metallic clank of approaching footsteps echoed through the tunnel. David's grip on his belt tightened. He had no weapon, no armor, just his instincts and whatever Liara's mysterious past could offer them. Liara did not move, her violet eyes glowing faintly. She was not afraid. The first Vexeri soldier stepped into view, a towering humanoid machine, its blue visor scanning the room. Unauthorized presence detected, it announced in a cold, robotic voice. Surrender immediately. David exchanged a look with Liara. Surrender was not an option. Before he could say anything, Liara raised her hand. A silver ripple of energy burst from her palm, surging toward the soldier. It struck the machine's chest, sending sparks flying as the force threw it backward into the tunnel wall. David's heart pounded. That's one way to answer. But more were coming. Through the entrance, 3 more Vexeri machines advanced, their weapons glowing with charged energy. David ducked as the first shot was fired. The air sizzled, the blast narrowly missing him. Liara stood firm, her eyes burning with power. But David could see the strain on her face. She was still weak. They couldn't win this fight. Not like this. His mind raced. Think, Carter. Think. Then his eyes landed on the central pillar, the heart of the ancients. If this was a weapon, then maybe. Liara, he shouted, can you activate this thing? She hesitated, looking at the pillar, then at the advancing machines. She didn't know, but they had no choice. David rushed to the console, running his hands over the glowing symbols. He had no idea what he was doing, but he had to try. The chamber shook as another blast was fired. Liara threw up a shimmering energy barrier, blocking the attack, but her knees trembled. She couldn't hold on much longer. David's fingers moved quickly over the controls, pressing symbols that seemed to pulse in response to his touch. Suddenly, the room exploded with light. The floating crystals above them shifted, their glow intensifying. The Vexeri machines paused, their systems flickering. Then, the voice of the chamber spoke again. Final protocol initiated, awakening the last guardian. David barely had time to react before the ground trembled beneath them. A deep rumbling sound came from beneath the pillar, and suddenly, the floor began to split apart. Something was rising. David grabbed onto the nearest ledge as a massive figure emerged from the ground. A colossal metallic being, taller than the Vexeri soldiers, with ancient silver plating and glowing golden eyes. It wasn't a machine. It was something more. The Vexeri immediately opened fire, their energy blasts striking the enormous guardian. But they did nothing. The guardian turned its head slowly, its gaze locking onto the Vexeri forces. Then, in a deep, resonant voice, it spoke. Enemy identified. Initiating purge. Before the Vexeri could react, the guardian raised its massive arm and, in a single motion, unleashed a blinding beam of energy. The force ripped through the Vexeri soldiers, sending them flying as their metallic bodies shattered into pieces. David shielded his eyes from the explosion of light. When the energy faded, the entrance to the chamber was clear. The Vexeri were gone. Silence fell. David exhaled sharply, turning to Liara. She was breathing heavily, her body weakened from using so much power. But in her eyes, there was something new. Hope. David looked up at the guardian, still standing tall. Well, he said, wiping sweat from his brow, I think we found our weapon. Liara let out a quiet laugh, the first one he had heard from her. Then she looked at him with newfound determination. This is only the beginning. The massive guardian stood motionless, its golden eyes glowing softly in the dim chamber. The air was thick with the scent of burned metal, the remains of the Vexari machines scattered across the floor. David exhaled slowly, running a hand through his sweat-soaked hair. He had seen many things in his travels, but nothing like this. A weapon buried for centuries, waiting to be awakened. Liara, still weak from using her energy, leaned against the control pillar, her breath shallow. David stepped toward her. "You okay?" She nodded, but he could tell she was exhausted. I didn't expect it to still function," she admitted, looking up at the Guardian. "It should not have responded so quickly." David frowned. "You mean it wasn't supposed to wake up?" Liara placed a hand on the pillar's surface, and the ancient markings flickered beneath her touch. "The last Guardian was meant to be controlled only by my people," she said. "Yet it listened to you." David stiffened. "Me?" Liara turned her violet eyes toward him, studying his face. "You touched the console. The system accepted you." David looked at the glowing controls. He had pressed random symbols, hoping for the best. But somehow, it had worked. Before he could ask, the Guardian's head turned slightly, its golden eyes flickering as it spoke again. Danger approaching. David's heart skipped a beat. Liara straightened, her expression tense. "The Vexari are regrouping." David clenched his fists. "We need to get out of here." Liara nodded. "The tunnels lead to the valley below. If we reach open ground, we might." Before she could finish, the chamber shook violently. A deep, thunderous explosion echoed through the cavern. Rocks tumbled from above, dust filling the air. David shielded his face, coughing. What was that? Liara closed her eyes for a moment, sensing the energy beyond the chamber. Then her eyes snapped open. "They're bringing a warship." David's stomach dropped. "A warship?" Liara nodded. "They fear what we have awakened. They will not risk fighting inside. They will bury us instead." David cursed under his breath. If the Vexari couldn't win, they would destroy everything. Another tremor rocked the chamber. The ceiling cracked, and dust poured down in thick clouds. "We have to move," David shouted. Liara took a deep breath, pushing herself forward despite her exhaustion. "The Guardian will follow us." David turned toward the massive being. "You coming?" The Guardian's golden eyes flickered again. "Protect the key. Follow the command." David wasn't sure what that meant, but he wasn't about to argue. Liara led the way, her hands glowing faintly as she activated an ancient passage. The walls shifted, revealing a hidden exit, and the three of them, David, Liara, and the towering Guardian, hurried into the darkness. The Valley of Shadows. The tunnel opened into the valley, a vast, rocky expanse hidden beneath the mountain's shadow. David gasped at the sight above them. A massive Vexari warship loomed in the sky, its dark metal hull blocking out the stars. Bright blue energy beams charged along its underbelly. "They're going to fire," David shouted. Liara's eyes burned with anger. "They would destroy this entire land just to erase me." The Guardian stepped forward, its massive form casting a shadow over them. David glanced at Liara. "Can it stop that thing?" She hesitated. "It is powerful, but alone." She shook her head. "We need more." David thought fast. There has to be something here. This was a sanctuary, right? Liara suddenly gasped, turning to the far side of the valley. She pointed. "There." David followed her gaze, and his breath caught. Buried beneath layers of dust and stone were more ancient machines, their bodies covered in vines and rust, but their cores still glowing faintly. More Guardians. David's pulse raced. "Can you wake them up?" Liara placed her hand on the nearest one. Her energy flickered weakly, but the response was instant. The machine's eyes flickered, its systems slowly coming online. David's chest tightened. If they could wake enough of these things. A deep roar of energy filled the air. The warship was ready to fire. Liara turned to David, her face set with determination. "Help me." David didn't know how or why, but something in his blood responded to this place. He placed his hands on another dormant guardian. The valley trembled. One by one, the ancient warriors awakened. David grinned as the first guardian stood tall, its golden eyes blazing to life. The Vexeri had no idea what was coming. The valley trembled as the ancient guardians awakened, their golden eyes burning like stars in the darkness. Dust and debris fell away from their massive forms, revealing towering bodies made of silver and obsidian metal, crafted by a civilization long lost to time. David stepped back, heart pounding as the guardians came to life one by one. The energy in the air was thick. Something powerful had been set in motion. Above them, the Vexari warship loomed, its charged cannons glowing blue. Lara turned to David, her eyes fierce with determination. They will fire at full force. The guardians must strike first. David nodded quickly. Then let's make sure they do. He stepped toward the nearest guardian, its tall frame humming with energy. Can you hear me? The guardian's head turned slightly, golden eyes flickering. Then it spoke, awaiting command. David's breath caught. It was listening to him. Lara placed a glowing hand on another guardian. They are connected to the ancient system. You triggered it when you touched the pillar. David swallowed hard. Then let's give them something to fight for. Above them, the warship roared, its engines blazing as its cannons locked onto the valley below. Target acquired. A deep mechanical hum filled the air. The Vexari were ready to wipe them out. David's fists clenched. Not today. He turned back to the Guardian army. Defend this place. Destroy the enemy. The ground trembled as the Guardians moved in unison, their massive bodies shifting with ancient strength. Then, they attacked. The battle begins. A blinding golden beam of energy shot from the lead Guardian's chest, ripping through the sky. The warship trembled under the impact, its shields crackling violently. The Vexeri immediately returned fire, unleashing a barrage of plasma shots toward the valley. David grabbed Lyra's hand and ran as the ground exploded around them, sending rock and dust flying. The Guardians, however, stood strong. One by one, they launched their counterattack, firing searing beams of energy, hurling massive chunks of stone, and even leaping into the air to strike at the warship directly. David watched in awe as one Guardian leaped high, landing onto the warship's hull, its massive fists tearing into the metal plating like paper. Lyra's power flickered around her hands as she focused, sending waves of energy into the Guardians, strengthening them. David turned to her. Can you hold on? She nodded, though her body trembled. I have to. Above them, the warship shuddered as another Guardian ripped one of its cannons off, sending it spiraling to the ground. The Vexari, once confident, now faced an enemy they had never prepared for. The Guardians were winning, the warship's last move, but the Vexari were not done yet. A deep, chilling voice echoed from the ship's command core. Activate Doomsday Protocol. David's stomach dropped. That doesn't sound good. Lyra's eyes widened in alarm. They are going to overload the core. They'll destroy everything. David cursed under his breath. If the warship exploded here, it wouldn't just kill them. It would wipe out the entire valley, including the Guardians. We have to stop it, he shouted. Lyra clenched her fists. There is only one way. She turned to the lead Guardian, placing both hands against its massive chest. A pulse of energy surged between them. The Guardian glowed brighter, its golden eyes burning like twin suns. Then, without hesitation, it launched itself into the sky, aiming straight for the warship's core. David watched in disbelief. It's going to sacrifice itself. Lyra's voice was soft, but resolute. It knows its purpose. The Guardian pierced through the warship's outer hull, disappearing inside. For a long, breathless moment, nothing happened. Then, a massive explosion erupted from within the warship. The ship's engines flared uncontrollably, its entire structure breaking apart from the inside. David grabbed Lyra, shielding her as a shockwave of golden energy tore across the sky. The Vexari warship crumbled, its remains falling in burning chunks into the distant mountains. The battle was over. A new dawn. Silence settled over the valley. David slowly stood, looking at the sky where the warship had once been. The Guardian had given its life to ensure their survival. Lyra, tired but standing, watched as the remaining Guardians powered down, their purpose fulfilled. David turned to her. "It's over." She nodded, but there was a faraway look in her eyes. For now, David exhaled, placing his hands on his hips. "So, what happens next?" Lyra looked at him, her violet eyes filled with something new, hope. "We rebuild," she said softly. "We prepare." David raised an eyebrow. "For what?" She gazed into the distance. "The Vexari will return. But this time, we will be ready." A small smile tugged at David's lips. He had come to this mountain as an explorer, but now he was something more. A fighter, a protector, and maybe, just maybe, a legend. As the first rays of morning light touched the valley, David and Lyra stood together, ready for whatever the future held. Because this was not the end. It was just the beginning. The end, or the start of a new story.